Hello, and welcome to the Lincoln Journey. We're on part 11 of the Conspirators, the story of the Lincoln assassination. By now, almost all of the big fish were in the net, but the biggest fish of all, Booth, was still at large, as were a couple of the larger ones, David Herold and John Surratt. Herold had been identified as the horseman who had closely followed Booth over the Navy Yard Bridge. Surratt's name started cropping up immediately after the assassination due to his close ties to Booth. Vengeful investigators wanted so badly to capture him that they wouldn't believe his mother when she said he was in Canada. He was in Canada, but Mary Surratt had lied about so much else that they assumed she was lying about this as well. The prisoners deemed most dangerous were confined to the ironclads anchored out in the East Potomac by the Navy Yard. Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin, George Atzerodt, Hartman Richter, a Portuguese sea captain named Joao Celestino, and Edman Spangler were confined there. I have not yet properly introduced Ned Spangler. In any serious retelling of the Lincoln assassination story, his name would have arisen long before now. He did make a brief appearance in part 7. Booth and Spangler first met when Junius Brutus Booth Sr., John Wilkes' father, hired carpenter Spangler to help build his summer house, Tudor Hall, outside of Baltimore in 1854, when John was 16. They next met in 1862 at Ford's Theater, where Spangler was now a scene shifter and Booth a famous actor. They shared the same pro-Confederate political views, and Ned was understandably dazzled by the charismatic star. Booth kept a stable in Baptist Alley behind the theater. I never told you about that either, did I? And he got Spangler and Joseph Peanut John Burroughs to care for his horses when he was away. To this point, it would be easy to believe that Spangler was involved in the conspiracy or that he was not involved in the conspiracy. However, on the night of the shooting, events cast a much stronger suspicion on him. Booth rode up to the back door of the theater and called specifically for Ned. He wanted him to hold the reins of the spirited mare that didn't like to be tied up. Ned came out, but he was busy with the scenery in the play, which was already in progress. He told Peanut John to hold the horse and then returned backstage, where he still was when Booth ran through the theater and out the back door after shooting Lincoln. Earlier in the day, Spangler had helped remove the partition that divided the presidential box into two smaller boxes for when less august personages used it. Consequently, Spangler was accused of preparing the box's anteroom for Booth so that he could bar the outer door, and of helping Booth escape the theater. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ned Spangler was in the wrong place over and over again. Also caught up in a web of circumstantial evidence was Mary Surratt. The Surratt that didn't get away was the mother of Booth's frequent companion. She owned a house where Booth was often seen. She owned the tavern in Maryland where Booth had stopped after the assassination. She even had a picture of Booth hidden in the back of a picture frame in her room. The house on 8th Street had been thoroughly searched on the night that Mary was arrested. A dispassionate observer may have very charitably given her the benefit of the doubt for these conceivably innocent facts, but very soon the statements of witnesses fatally incriminated her. Let's back up. Mary Elizabeth Jenkins was born to a fairly well-to-do Maryland family in either 1820 or 1823. She married the fairly well-to-do John Surratt, and they experienced a sustained period of financial well-to-doness, owning farms and other properties. However, John suffered from alcoholism, which led to him becoming increasingly abusive and to start defaulting on debts. He died of a stroke in 1862. The Surratts had 3 children, Isaac, John Jr., and Anna. The family owned a varying number of slaves over the years, but Mary sold some to satisfy debts, then some ran away during the war, and then Maryland abolished slavery in 1864. When the war broke out, Isaac enlisted in a Confederate cavalry battalion in Texas. John soon began his involvement with the Confederate Secret Service, although he kept the Surrattsville postmaster position that he inherited from his father until it was withdrawn from him in 1863 due to his alleged rebel sympathies. Mary kept the family home at Surrattsville until October 1st, 1864, when they moved to the house at 604 H Street Northwest in Washington. The 4-story townhouse had been let to renters prior to that, and Mary continued to rent rooms when she took active possession. At the same time, she began her rental agreement with John Lloyd at the Surrattsville Tavern. As discussed before, both the boarding house and the tavern became rebel safe houses, with the number of Confederate spies, couriers, and soldiers making clandestine visits. It was hard for federal investigators, and ultimately the military court that tried her, to believe that Mary wasn't at least aware of and likely involved in efforts to undermine the lawful authority. More specifically, investigators suspected that she had a connection to the Lincoln assassination, considering the frequency of John Wilkes Booth's visits, compounded by visits from Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt. Concrete allegations came from sources that surely disappointed Mary. Louis Weichmann, the former divinity school classmate of Mary's son John, became a boarder at H Street on November 1st, 1864. He was in company with Booth and the other conspirators about as much as Mary was, and thus fell under heavy suspicion himself. Likewise, John Lloyd, Mary's tenant at the tavern, he claimed that he didn't know Booth, which may have been true, but he complied readily when Booth and Herold showed up asking for the carbines and the binoculars. Consequently, both Weichmann and Lloyd had plenty of incentive to rat out their friend, or perhaps even to bear false witness against her. Let us then try to evaluate, at a remove of 157 years, the evidence we've already presented. In Part 3, we discussed the events of March 17, 1865. Booth called the conspirators together at short notice to set up an abduction of the president on his return to Washington from a play at a hospital just out of town. Since Lincoln wasn't even present at the play, the plan came to nothing, probably at Booth's connivance. But according to Weichmann, when he went to ask Mary Surratt why her son and the others were riding off in a gang, he found her sobbing and saying, "John has gone away." Why was she so upset? John went away often, risking capture as a secret courier. What was different now? The implication is that Mary knew he was now involved in a more dangerous assignment, the kidnapping of the president. In Part 4, we saw Weichmann drive Mary into Maryland on April 11th to seek out a debtor. On the road, they chanced to meet John Lloyd. After some desultory conversation, Mary asked Lloyd, "Are those firearms still hidden?" Lloyd realized she was talking about the carbines that John Surratt had stuffed into the tavern's kitchen ceiling. Why did Mary know about the carbines? Did she know that Booth wanted to pick them up when he took a post-assassination powder? If she had known about them just in connection to the kidnapping plot, she would have known that the kidnapping had been called off, wouldn't she? Well, not necessarily, but she knew about the guns for some reason. In Part 5, we met Richard Smoot, who went to H Street on April 12th to try to collect on the boat he sold to son John. Mary asked Smoot if the boat was in its place and ready to go. So she knew about the guns and the boat. And remember, John had left for Canada on April 3rd, and this is April 12th. One gets the impression that Mary was discussing these matters with Booth, and one is easily convinced that she knew more details than where 2 carbines and a rowboat had been hidden. From Part 7, April 14th, the day of the assassination, Mary once again had Louis Weichmann drive her to Surrattsville. This time it is no chance meeting with John Lloyd on the road. Lloyd wasn't even there when they arrived, so they waited for him. According to Lloyd, the following conversation took place. Upon his return with a wagon load of fish and oysters for the tavern, Mary approached him and said, "Talk about the devil and his imps will appear." "I was not aware that I was a devil before," Lloyd responded drunkenly. Then, out of Weichmann's earshot, Mary said, "Well, Mr. Lloyd, I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them." Then she gave him the package from Booth containing the binoculars and told him to have whiskey ready for the parties too. Let's assume for the moment that Lloyd was lying, that he was falsely accusing Mary of an involvement in the conspiracy. Maybe she didn't really mention the guns, but it seems clear that she took him the binoculars, and Booth and Herold collected them that night. Later on the 14th, Weichmann and Mary left after a supper at the tavern at about 6:30 p.m. When they got back to the boarding house in Washington, Booth was waiting for them. He and Mary spoke privately for a few minutes, then Booth left. He rode his rented horse to the rear of Ford's Theater about 6 blocks away. Why did he wait until immediately before he went to shoot the president to have a very short conversation with Mary Surratt? Did he want to be assured that all was in order and his supplies would be waiting for him in Surrattsville? Then there was an item not revealed in earlier episodes. On the April 14th ride down to Surrattsville, Mary and Lewis saw some soldiers doing picket duty along the side of the road. She stopped and asked one of them if they would be there all night. "No, ma'am," he said. "We're being pulled in after 8 o'clock. Thanking him, she said, "It is good to know that." Why would it be good to know that? Did she know that Booth would be using this road that night as an escape route? Is this more information that she shared with Booth later that night? From the above, Mary Surratt appears to have significant complicity with John Wilkes Booth and his plot, but all of the above, except for the statement of Richard Smoot, came from Lewis Weichmann and John Lloyd. That they had a strong motivation to testify against Mary is more emphatically true than most of us realize at first glance. Under the laws of that day, defendants could not be witnesses. They could not even testify on their own behalf. The government had to decide if it wanted to bring charges against people like Weichmann and Lloyd and Samuel Mudd, or to use them as witnesses. They couldn't do both. The plea bargain, as we know it today, where a defendant is allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for offering testimony against another defendant, was unknown at that time. Given this situation, Weichmann and Lloyd made the most of their first-hand knowledge of Mary Surratt's involvement to get off of the suspect list and onto the witness list. This complicates our case against Mary, but it doesn't move us to exonerate her. Other boarders and employees at the H Street house spoke of her private meetings with Booth and the other conspirators, corroborating Weichmann's testimony. The trial situation must be examined at some length, which we will do later. Because although there was clearly a conspiracy to kill Abraham Lincoln, the way the defendants were convicted was way messed up. But let's get the rest of the defendants arrested or killed, as the case may be, and then we will review the trial. Many of you will stand aghast at the conduct of the trial, and I hope you will post selfies of your jaws dropping in astonishment. First, though, you may have heard me mention another new suspect along with Edman Spangler. A Portuguese sea captain? What's that all about? João Celestino, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, was a captain whose ship was condemned as a prize of war in June of 1864 for violating the federal blockade of southern ports. Celestino claimed he was on a legitimate trip between neutral ports, but he lost his case, lost his ship, and lost a couple $1,000s in cash taken with the ship that he claimed was his. This embittered him against Secretary of State William Seward, whom he held personally responsible. He hung around Washington for several months. The night of the assassination, he took a train to Philadelphia. However, before he left, he was heard to say he wished he could kill William Seward for all the trouble the secretary had caused him. Word of this reckless statement filtered up to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton as he gathered facts from near and far in the back parlor of the Peterson House. Celestino was arrested in Philadelphia on April 18th and sent to Old Capitol Prison in Washington. On April 26th, he was transferred to the Montauk along with the most notorious arrestees. He was later transferred with the others to the penitentiary on the grounds of the Washington Arsenal, where the trial took place. He stayed there uncharged until the day after 4 of the conspirators were executed. When he was released, he was told to leave the country in 10 days. He didn't. He was still there a year later trying to get money out of the government. There's an American Heritage article from 1957 that wonders if he was compelled to spy for the feds once he was incarcerated. The treatment of Celestino is a stark example of the summary judgment employed by the U.S. government in handling the assassination case. Were people treated unjustly without recourse to the legal protections enshrined in the Constitution? Yes. Is this understandable? If you remember the days and months following September 11, 2001, I'll let you answer that question for yourself. As in that situation, the United States in 1865 was shocked by an unimaginable attack and filled with fear and uncertainty over whether more attacks were imminent. The authorities conducted their investigation and meted out justice and/or revenge with a heavy hand, and they were not particularly mindful of collateral damage. So ends episode 11. See you next time for part 12 of The Conspirators.